Well, good morning. How many of you are here? It's good. That's good. Well, I've got to tell you, I almost don't feel like coming up here because we just had a message. And Taylor, so proud of you. And the rest of the ladies that are there. 180. It's powerful. And you fit right into my message today, too. So I appreciate you doing it on this day. But thank you. And the leaders, you'll see in my message as I talk that you may not realize today the effect that you're having on people for eternity. So thank you for what you do. Thank you so much. Well, it's great to be here, and I got to tell you, it's been, I think it's been a few years since I was here as a missionary. It was back when Pastor Lee was here, when I first came, and then with Pastor Jason. But I got to tell you, whether you're sitting in this church, Rivers, or whether you're in Nairobi, Kenya, or you're in Indonesia, where I was last week, where there are people that want to meet with God, He's always there. He's always there. And it's great to be with you this morning. I'm glad to hear that Jason and the team are down in Mexico, and continue to pray for them that lives will be touched and changed. How many of you, I know most of the kids are out, but if you're, I think I've got one young lady here. I met her earlier. They called her Crazy One. And her mother is crazy too. Is that right? Is that right? Yes. But great family. And how many of you are still a kid at heart? I hope you are. And you know, I'm going to talk to you as though you're kids just for a second. But how many of you kids know that God loves you? If you do, let me see your hand. How many of you think He loves every kid in Colorado? All right? Every kid in America, Asia, Europe, Africa. How many of you kids think He loves every kid around the world? He does. And you know what? I am so glad that God doesn't treat kids like lollipops. Mm-hmm. How many of you like lollipops? Yeah, I do. Do you have a favorite flavor? How many of you like orange? Okay. How many of you like lemon? Okay. How many of you like apple? You like every one, don't you, sir? How many of you love grape? Okay, here it comes. How many of you love root beer? Okay, I hit the spot. I knew that was coming. Coca-Cola? And then one of my favorites, bubble gum. Yeah. Can you imagine if God treated kids like lollipops? Can you imagine if God said, oh, I found my favorite kid that I died for. Yes, I love the orange kid. That's my favorite. No, forget the orange kid. Forget the orange kid. No, I died for the lemon kid of Colorado. No, forget that lemon kid. No, I love the apple kid. No, forget the apple kid. No. Oh, here we go. This is the one that I died for. It's the grape kid. In fact, I love the grape kid so much. That's the one I'm going to keep. That's my favorite. It's going to stick right to me. But you know what? God doesn't treat kids like lollipops. In fact, young lady, can you come up here real quick for me? Can you do that, please? And I don't think you're crazy. I just think you're creative. Yes. So I'll tell you what. What's your name? Kayla? That used to be my name too. No, I'm kidding. Kayla, I want you to reach in here, and whatever one you pull out, that is God's favorite flavored kid, okay? All right. This is the one that, just one, Kayla. This is God's most favorite. Kayla, just one. This is God's, no, Kayla, I just need one, okay? This is God's, Kayla, can you just get one, please? What?
There isn't any in there.
You know what, Caleb? You are exactly right. You see, God doesn't have just one favorite, but he loves every single one of us. And Kayla, especially you. Give Kayla a big hand as she goes down. There you go. You can take that with you. I love to minister to kids. And by the way, how many of you would like to know how I did that? I did it very well. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. How many of you can keep a secret? Yeah, so can I. I've got to tell you, my wife sends her greetings to you today. She is back in Springfield, Missouri. When we're home from overseas, that's where we live. And she's home. My youngest daughter just got home from university and thought they would spend the day together. So she sends her greetings. African culture is that when someone can't go somewhere, they send their greetings, and the thing back is, may I take a greeting from you back to her? Thank you. Thank you. You know, when I've got 5 kids, Tanya, Shauna, Clayton, JJ, and Sadie. They're 37, 38, 36, 34, 20, and 19. Now you know why I'm still in children's ministries. And I've got to tell you, when Clayton, my 34-year-old, 34, 35-year-old, when he was about a year and a half, he came down with an infection called thrush. And parents that know about that, it's like blisters in your throat, your stomach, and your mouth. He was hospitalized, very ill. About a week later, he came out of the hospital, but still was running a temperature. And that night, when we put him to bed, he never gets out of his crib. But that night at 1:30 in the morning, he came into our room, and he was burning up, and my wife gave him medicine. We put him in our bed, and we fell asleep. And 15 minutes later, my wife screamed, oh God, Jay, turn on the light, turn on the light. And when I turned on the light, Clayton had gone into convulsions. He'd gone into seizures. I'd never seen that before, to see my son with his eyes wide open, with them rolled up in the back of his head, shaking uncontrollably. And I grabbed that body, and when I did, it went limp, with the eyes still open. And I didn't know if he was dead or alive. And we rushed him to the hospital. When we got to Kaiser Hospital, they took him. They began to work on him. And the doctor came out a little bit later and said, look, he should be all right. He's had what we call a grandma seizure, caused because of high temperature. But when we get it down, we'll give him back to you, and you can take him home. And at 4 o'clock in the morning, they handed him back to us. We went out, put him in the car seat, snapped him in, and as we got out on Hayward Avenue to get back on Highway 880, he went into a second convulsion. And I rushed back, and I'm blowing the horn. They run out, they grab him, they run in, and they begin to work on him again. And the doctor came back out and said, look, he's had another seizure. We think when the temperature gets down. And I said, Doc, hold it. How am I going to know that when I have him at home and he's laying in the crib, and I think that he's laying there peacefully, how do I know whether he's really dead or alive? And the doctor just kind of grinned and said, let me tell you how you'll know if he's alive. Well, I got to tell you that years went by, and when he was 4.5, he was in the house. Debbie and I walked in, and just in time to see him look at us and watch the eyes roll up into his head, and he fell back on the carpet. And I grabbed that limp body. He wasn't shaking, but his eyes were open, rolled up, and I said, Clayton, look at me. No response. Clayton, look at me. No response. And then I remembered what the doctor said. If I wanted to know whether it was dead or alive, what to do. And I very quickly reached and found that main blood vessel that runs through the neck. And when I put my hand on it, I could feel the beat of the blood passing in his body. I put my hand in front of his mouth and nose, and I could feel the air going in and out. And then I thought of something. I looked at that limp body and I said, Clayton, if you're playing a trick on mommy and daddy, you stop right now or you are in big trouble. And those eyes rolled down. A little grin came across his face, and he said, Daddy,
I was just playing.
He is just like his mother. Just like his mother. But how did I know that he was alive? How did I know there was life? It's the fact that when I reached out and I touched the blood, there was something there, non-verbally, that was saying, this is life. It is beating. It is real. It's not changing. It's here. This is life. Do you realize today that there are people walking around Africa and Asia and Europe, in Colorado, and right here in Delta today, adults and teens and kids that are reaching out saying, what can I touch that will give me life? What can I reach out and touch that's not a high today but a low tomorrow? What can I reach out that when I touch, it will say, this is real. It's not changing. It's going to change you. It's here today, tomorrow, yesterday. I've got to tell you, my job is Children's Ministry Specialist International for the Assemblies of God. As a missionary, I'm in 10 to 12 countries a year. I've been in 46 countries around the world. I've already been in 1 year, we've been in 12 more countries. And I've got to tell you, as I travel and to see what people put their faith in, to just be in Indonesia just last week, to be there for 3.5 weeks and walk in and see the people lighting their incense and praying to their Buddha God, believing that he will answer. To go into Nairobi, Kenya and get into the taxi. We lived there for 8.5 years, and I would get into a taxi and see the Hindu driver with all the little plastic gods across their dashboard, 117 of them, believing that they pray to one of them, the God will answer. To go into places and hear them believe in other gods. But how many of you know that when you believe and worship in something that's not real, it cannot answer? But I've got to tell you this morning, as we begin to worship God and we begin to lift our hands, we weren't worshiping a statue. We weren't worshiping a piece of gold. We weren't worshiping a rock, but we were worshiping a God that is alive today. A God that when we say, God, I need you, he says, I'm here and I will beat in your life and it will never change and it'll be the same yesterday, today, and forever if you will trust me. If you will trust in me with all of your heart. You know what? God has given us a choice and a chance. You know that saying that says you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. Well, let me change it today. That says if you don't lead a horse to water, he may never have a chance to drink. And God has called us to be people that will stand in the gap between the living and the dead, between heaven and hell, to realize that what we do affects eternity forever. I've got to tell you one of my favorite Bible stories, and I wish I had time to read everything about it, but it's a story of David. Here is David, King David, who sinned, who did things against God, but it says David had a heart after God. And do you remember when he comes to Nathan the prophet, and he says, Nathan, I've just got done building my own house of timbers, but now I want to build a house for God. He doesn't have a place to even put the Ark of the Covenant. I'm going to build a house for him, a temple. And what does Nathan say? Hey, do what's in your heart. But God speaks to Nathan and says, go tell David it cannot be done, that he cannot be the one to do it. And so he goes to David and says, David, God has said, David, because of all the blood that you've shed through the wars, and God has had his blessing on you, you can't build the temple, but it will happen through your seed. It will happen through your child. You look, David doesn't get upset. He doesn't throw a fit. He doesn't go against God, but he listens to God. And what does he do? He decides, if I can't be there to build it, I will do everything I can to prepare for the building of that temple. And you look at what he does. He gathers up all the stone cutters. He gathers up the stone cutters, the masons, the carpenters. He gets all the gold and silver and iron and bronze that he had taken from the wars. Then he begins to write out every plan, every detail of the place that he's going to build. And when he's done with everything for the temple. He turns it over to Solomon. Solomon becomes the king, and David dies. And you read later that when that temple is built, and Solomon begins to preach, what does Solomon say? He said in 2 Chronicles 6:8, "But the Lord said to my father David, because it was in your heart to build a temple for my name, you did well. I give you credit for what was in your heart." You see, the first thing David did is that David touched the future by what he did today. David had a heart to touch the future by what he did today. He wasn't even there for the end result. But what he did in planning, everything came together, and he was glorified to God, and God blessed him. And I want to remind you today that we can affect the future by what we do today. Every word, every action, everything we do, what happens today, you think about your words, and this is a big thing in my life today. I'm writing a book called The Egg Handler, and it talks about whether we take an egg, and are we an egg carrier, or are we an egg dropper? Do we shatter the shells of people's lives because of the things we say and the things that we do? Are we an egg carrier that when we see a crack in someone's life, we're willing to pick them up and help bring them to maturity and introduce them to God? You see, the Bible says that our words have power to give life or they give death. And do you understand that David affected the future by what he did? I've got to tell you that we've been in children's ministries for 39 years. Not by default, by choice, because I honestly believe that if you change a child for Jesus, you can change a family. You change a family, you can change a community. You change a community, you can change the world. And I've got to tell you, I have believed in children's ministries. There's a statistic that came out from a man who does statistics. He's the guru of statistics by the name of Barna. And as he began to put statistics together, he said it slapped him in the face, and he was embarrassed when he began to realize the people that give their lives to the Lord in the United States, ages 5 to 12, that 33% of kids say they have a born-again relationship with Jesus Christ. But ages 13 to 19, only 4% of our population. And ages 19 through adult, only 6%. Which basically says that if you don't reach someone with Jesus at the age when they're a child, the chances of reaching them get so much slim. We know it does work. You just take a look over here. But I've got to tell you, reaching a child is so important. I've got to tell you, I stood in First Assembly God in San Diego, and it wasn't 180 sitting to the left, but sitting to the right was Teen Challenge. And afterwards, one of the men came up to me. He said, "I got to tell you my story." He said, "I never knew my dad." He said, "My mom worked and never had time for me." And he said, "I was broken. But at the age of 8, there's some people that came around me that showed me what they said was love, and I got into a gang." And he said, at the age of 13, I killed my first person. And he said, I was sentenced, was found guilty, and I spent 11 years in prison. And he said, when I got out, I tried prostitution and alcohol and drugs. And he said, I finally tried to commit suicide, but I didn't succeed. But then someone introduced me to Jesus Christ. He said, Teen Challenge, I went in there, I found out about Jesus, and he said, I stand today as a 30-year-old to tell you that I'm living for the Lord, and I love him with all of my life, and I thank God for Teen Challenge. And I've got to tell you, I love that testimony. I love the testimony that you hear, and I've heard during sectional tour, many of the ladies give their testimony. And I love that, but then I turn around and say how much I love my testimony. Is the fact that I was introduced to Jesus Christ when I was 4.5 years old. And I gave my life to him, and I will tell you, I can remember it as though it was yesterday. And he came into my life, and yes, there's been times that I've pressed the boundaries and I've pushed against it. But I knew he was there, and I walked with him, and I stand today as a 61-year-old, still jumping around stages all over the world telling kids about Jesus Christ. But I've got to tell you, he's never left me. He's never forsaken me, and he's always been there. And I tell you, I live for him today. You know what that testimony is? First, the Teen Challenge man, that was a man that had fallen off the cliff of life and almost died spiritually, emotionally, mentally. But thank God for Teen Challenge and the ambulance of Jesus Christ that changed his life. But my testimony is this: I never fell off the cliff of life because I had a church, I had parents, and I had people that put a hedge around the top so I couldn't fall off in the first place. And I've got to tell you, our world is broken. And Taylor, when I heard your testimony, I honestly said, why couldn't we have been there when you were a child? We have people that are broken around us every day. And sometimes you may not see it in a child, but when the parents are divorced or separated, the guilt comes to them. The bullying that happens day after day, and I could tell you what happened to my own son and what he busted through to be able to stand before God and be talented today, but was destroyed by the bullying. And that brokenness starts young. And I believed in my life, we've got to make this change. And I went into children's ministries, and from 1980 to 1990, we were a children's pastor, and I saw God do great things, but God called us to Africa to be the director of children's ministries for East Africa, and we said, we'll go. And we were ready to pack up 3 of our 5 children because 2 of them hadn't come along yet. But we got everything ready, and I was visiting churches, telling them what I planned on doing, and I'll never forget going into a church, Bethel San Jose in California. And I began to share how I believe, because there were so many kids, 490 million kids in Africa, and they're everywhere, that we could go into the villages with gorilla costumes, a yellow gorilla, an orange gorilla costume, put them in the back of a pickup truck, drive through the village and call the kids to come. And they would follow us, because I tried it on a missions trip, and we gathered up 2,000 kids in about an hour. And I began to share the vision of what God had laid on my heart. And I got home. We were 3 weeks away from closing the doors to our container that would have everything in it that we would take to Africa. And I got a phone call from a man a week later. He said, Jay, I go to Bethel San Jose, got your number off your prayer card. He said, do you still need some gorilla costumes? I said, yeah, I do. He said, okay, I'm going to send you some. Where do I get them? I said, right the Gorilla Factory. What a place. I told him what to get. I got to tell you, he lied to me. The man lied to me. A package came, but it wasn't 1 box. It was 23 boxes. He had bought me 46 gorilla costumes. And we loaded those into the container. But can I just back it up a little bit, that while I was at Bethel San Jose, the next weekend I was at Capital Christian Center. I again shared and told them how entertainment, I used to perform at Six Flags Over Georgia, Texas, Mid-America, and Disneyland. I used to do TV commercials. In fact, some of you old-timers, you remember, they didn't have America's Got Talent. They had The Gong Show. All right? I was on The Gong Show. That opened the door for me to begin to do TV commercials with my ventriloquism. And I was in this church, and I was sharing with them that I wanted to be able to do television in Kenya. And when we got done, a young man walked up to me. He said, my wife and I feel impressed that we need to give you some money toward a camera. He said, a personal camera that you can begin to use stuff. He said, how much would it cost for a good camera and editing? And I hadn't thought about it. I thought, okay, do I tell them 20,000? Do I tell them 1,000? And I felt like the Lord said 5,000. So I said $5,000. He said, come with me. He walked me over to his wife and he said, the Lord spoke to my wife and spoke to me. And we both said, how much? And we both said, no, just write it down and we'll see if it's the same. And he said, we have the same number. He said, let me show you. And he unfolded the paper and it said $5,000. I thought, oh God, thank you, I didn't get greedy. But I've got to tell you, we bought that camera. And can I tell you that when we got to Kenya and I began to see the children everywhere and the door began to open. Well, in fact, let me not just tell you about it. Let me show you a couple things. I began to go into the schools and I can tell you that the schools, every kid is in uniform. They don't have shoes many times because they can't afford it. But this is every school in Kenya, every school in Africa. Oh, by the way, this is an up-close picture. Let me show you the far away. You see, there's over 2,500 kids in the school. And the neat thing is that I can go into the schools and I can share the gospel through illusion and story and wild outfits. And I can go in and I can share the gospel and I can give an altar call and I can see their hands raised. But I've got to tell you, it was amazing as we began to do this, realizing now that because education is free in Kenya, that the Muslims, the Sikhs, the Hindus, this Muslim girl and her friends were in this school, Bidi Elementary. And as they stood in front of me and I got to that point of sharing with them about trusting in the Lord with all your heart and letting God have a chance in your life, I said, with your eyes closed, kids, if you want to give Jesus a chance and you're willing to do that, I just want you to raise your hand and look at me and nod. And down in front of me were 3 Muslim girls with their arms crossed. And 2 of them looked at each other and shook their head no in defiance. And they looked over at this girl. And she looked at them, dropped her hands, looked at me, and shook her head yes. That Muslim girl, along with others, gave their life to the Lord that day. In this school of 3,000 kids, over 2,000 kids gave their life to the Lord. I saw the principal at the church I was preaching at Budu Budu Assembly of God that next Sunday. And as we began to talk, I said, it was so neat to see that Muslim girl and others give their life. He said, oh, let me tell you what happened to her. He said when she came back to school the next day, she was beat up profusely. Her parents had found out and said, you are Muslim and you will always be Muslim and you will denounce what you've done about this Jesus. And if you don't, we will beat you until we kill you. My heart sank, but I knew that was the price. I went back to that school 1.5 years ago. We got done, and again, a great program with the kids and using the gorilla costumes. And I said, hey, whatever happened to that young lady? He said, oh, she's in what we would call middle school, hooked onto our school. Let me call for her. And when she came and she saw me, her eyes opened and a smile, and she ran and threw her arms around me. And I said to her, how are you? And she stepped back and she looked both sides and said, oh, I'm living for Jesus privately, but I love him very much. I said, how do you get to know about Jesus? She says, oh, I have been going to a soccer practice, a soccer club here at the school every Saturday, but it's more than soccer. She said, I learned about my Jesus. You know, my heart was touched. My heart was blessed. I've got to tell you real quick, though, and add this on. The next 2 pictures, it's not just Africa. It's going, oh, by the way, just tell you, this was last April. First kids camp we ever put together for Kenya. 4,000 kids, over 3,000 gave their life to the Lord. And just for thumbs up for BGMC, that stands for Boys and Girls Missionary Challenge, not bring God more cash, okay? But I've got to tell you, every prop, go back. Every prop along the wall there, everything I use, every illusion, everything we use on the TV show, everything we have was bought with BGMC funds, and you guys had a part in that, and I say thank you. But I've got to tell you, going into places like China, going into places like Japan, into Mongolia, God opens the door for us. Go ahead. And to be able to go in where I can only share morals and values until we do the underground kids crusades. And we get thousands of kids that come off the street. They just are told that there's a American entertainer. And we know if we get caught, we go to jail. But God's had his hand of protection. But I've got to tell you, we'll leave it sitting right there. God began to open doors for the training, going to places like Kisumu, where there's a squatters village across from the Bible college, putting the yellow gorilla and the orange gorilla in the back of it and driving through where you've got sewage running down between the mud huts and the tin roofs. And as we pulled in there with the gorilla costumes, 100,000 people living in a quarter-mile square. And as we were saying, Watoto, Watoto, Keribuni, Kwakanisa, children, you are welcome to come. You're welcome to come to the meeting for the kids, to see those kids scared to death of a yellow gorilla, but when they saw the gorilla waving, they followed us across, and to gather up 3,000 kids. And then the next day to have 4,000, and finally 5,000 kids, no more could fit in. Then to introduce them to the children's pastor. Today, in that church, runs a children's church of 1,500. To go to Nairobi Christian Center, a children's church of 1,800. To go to South Sea, a children's church of 500. To see what is happening. And God is doing miraculous things. But I got to tell you, when we saw the Muslims, the Sikhs, the Hindus come and they would stand outside, or if they came into the meeting and got saved, they would say, we can't tell anybody. And I began to say, God, how are you going to open the door that we can reach them? God had put television on my heart. And so I decided, God, open the door for television because I can get into their homes that way. And I went to KBC. I went in and talked to the head man in charge, second man in charge, and he was a Muslim, said he wasn't interested. I said, I'll buy airtime. He said, $5,000 a show. I said, I'm not interested. And I said, God, open the door. And it was through a Hindu man that used to attend university in St. Louis, Missouri. He saw me perform at Six Flags over Mid-America. And when he saw that and we began to talk, he said, my relatives owns the whole shopping center. Can you come at Christmas and put on 7 shows a day for 7 days like you did at Six Flags with your gorilla costumes and everything? And I said, yes, I'm going to talk about Jesus because he's the reason for the season. He says, you talk about your Jesus, they buy things out of our shops, we'll both be happy. We did 7 shows a day for 7 days. And I had many Asian men walking up with their business card going, could you do a birthday party? And I did a lot of birthday parties. But I had an African man walk up after one of the shows with his 2 girls and say, they called me Uncle Jay. Uncle Jay, that was the best thing I've ever seen. Please give me a call on Monday. When he left, I turned the card over, and it was Mr. Anabwani, the head deputy for the Kenya Broadcasting Corporation. I called him on Monday. He said, I love what I saw. I've never seen anything like that for kids. Do you think you could produce a TV program that we could air every single week on Kenya Broadcasting Corporation? It is a state-owned TV channel that reaches 30 million to 35 million a week. He said, do you think you could do that? I said, let me think about it. Yes, we can. And that was the beginning of Rainbow Surprise. A bright-colored, fast-moving, formatted television program that talked about the promises of God. And I got to tell you that after we did the pilot, he called us and said, all the directors think it's the best thing we've ever had. Start airing. We want to do it next month. Can I tell you what that began in 1993? Today, in 2019, is the #1 show in the country of Kenya. We reach over 20 million a week with Rainbow Surprise. We get texts, we get emails, we get letters from Muslims, Sikhs, Hindus, from every religion you can think of people who say, I've given my life to Jesus in the privacy of our home. I can't go into their temples. I can't go into their mosques, but I can go into their home through television. And I've got to tell you, why do we do this? It's for the end result that we want to see every kid in Africa, in Asia, in Europe, around the world, every kid raise their hand and say, I may be broken, but I want to be healed and I need Jesus. Now, can I tell you that we see that happening? I don't say this out of brag. In the last 12 months, we've seen over 40,000 kids come to know Jesus Christ. In my lifetime of children's ministries, we've seen just under 500,000 come to know Jesus. But I go back to this. The man who called me up and said, I'm sending you gorilla costumes. He had no idea the effect he would have on Africa. And he affected the future by what he did that day. The man who sent me the camera, he had no idea that what he was investing in, what was happening, they would change the life of 4 countries. Over 20 million a week because of his vision. An African man who was a Christian who walked up with his girls and said, I want you to start a television program. He had no idea what he was doing. The people that have stayed up at night, and I give my prayer cards out to kids and adults, and the people that have prayed for me, and a 9.5-year-old boy who came home from school and said, we got to pray for the Risners. We pray every night for them. No, we got to pray now. Why? Because I just know if we don't, they're in trouble. And as the dad walked in, the boy gathered up his 2 brothers and sister. And as they prayed and it got to him, he said, oh God, please protect the Risners. Please protect the Risners behind the bars. And the mom said, what do you mean behind the bars? Mom, she said, where people drink alcohol and go dancing? No. I saw a picture as I was praying at recess that they're behind metal bars. I don't know what they were, but people were trying to break them to get in to kill them. And so as they prayed, is exactly at 7 o'clock on November 13th of 1990. The time difference in Kenya where we were living was November 14th at 3 a.m., the exact second that the alarm went off on our house that my guard hit before they stoned him almost to death. And men came with bolt cutters and began to cut the bars. And as they went to cut the last one, which would have opened it up for them all to come in, the bolt cutter snapped. And it broke into the house, and they could not get in. And this 9.5-year-old boy had no idea that the exact minute we got a letter from the mother, it said, I don't know if this will make sense, but this is what happened on November 13th. If it makes sense, let us know. And to be able to write back and say, do you understand that the exact second we were being robbed, your boy led in prayer for us? You see, that family affected the future by what they did that day. And can I remind you that every day when you go to work, and every day when kids go to school, and every day when you're somewhere, you're going to walk past somebody. And sometimes people say, oh, I got to be led to do this, or I got to be led to do that. It's time you got to let out. And when you see a need, you move. When you see something, you're willing to move. And your words, your actions, when you see somebody that has been ridiculed and put down, I wish our teens were here to say, stand up for them. Be willing to stand and say, no, you are pretty. Yes, you are somebody. Can I remind every single one of you that God doesn't make mistakes. Nobody is born by accident, but He has a plan for every single one of us if we will allow Him to touch our life. Remember that it does say the greatest commandment is to love your God with all of your life and soul and strength. It says the second greatest commandment is to love your neighbor as yourself. Well, I've got to tell you, there is no way that you can love your neighbor if you don't love yourself. And God wants you to realize you can love yourself because he created you. Boy, am I getting off my notes for today. You see, and I'll go quickly. I better go quickly. The second thing is this. I want you to see what happened, that Daniel had a heart of sacrifice. David had a heart of sacrifice. Do you read in where David says, with all my resources I provide for the temple of God, gold and silver. He says what he's given. But he goes on and says this in 1 Chronicles 29:3. Besides in my devotion to the temple of God, I now give all my personal treasures of gold and silver. You see, David wasn't willing just to give what he had taken from out of the war, but he gave everything he had that was personally his. What is sacrifice? If you look at what sacrifice is, it's to forfeit one thing for another considered to be of greater value. It's when we're willing to give up what we have because we see that it can be of greater value. And folks, I've got to tell you, your prayer life and what you do to pray for others, when you give a helping hand, when you do stuff that is taking away from your own time, I've got to tell you, when you sacrifice, it makes a difference. I wish you could walk with us. And I'm going to show you a 1.5-minute video. As we begin to travel, I know it sounds a lot about Africa, but it's all over the world this is happening. But in Africa, there are people being saved and kids being saved. But the problem is there's no place to put the kids. So many of the churches, they don't have a room for the kids. And so they're out in the hot sun, and many of them pass out because it gets so hot. Or they're underneath a thorn bush, and they can go there. But if it rains, they cannot meet. And people begin to say, we can't do anything about it. But I believe that where there's vision, there is way. Where there's a vision from God, there is a way. I believe that God makes things happen. And one day, sitting with someone else, they said, why don't we begin to build children's church structures? Right now, there's so many churches that have no place for kids to meet. But I want you to see this. 5 minutes. There are so many great things to see in Africa, but there is one sight you will always see, no matter what time of year or season, and that's Africa's children. Children, children. Everywhere you look, you see children. 41% of the population is 14 and under. 490 million children. I've heard it said that children are the church of tomorrow. But can I tell you, they're not just the church of tomorrow. They're church of today. I walk the streets and I see kids everywhere that are left out. They're not involved in church. I believe that we can change the life of every African child. And how are we going to do it? Now is the time for empowering and planting a children's church structure in every church that is ready. I love the fact that there are thousands of churches going up across Africa, but there is something that is missing, and it's a place for the children to meet. And that's why it is so important that we build children's church structures, a place that they can call their own, a place where they can be ministered to and discipled. All across Africa, you will see that there are churches that have begun to do this, and they find out that when they build a structure, the children come. And that's why we've got to have children's church structures. We are asking for $2,000 per structure. Now, in some countries, that amount will build 2 structures. These churches are desperate for a place to put their children. They're in desperate need of a children's church structure. Thanks again for letting me share about one of the greatest opportunities, and that's reaching the children of Africa. It has to happen. Africa's children now. Right now, there are so many churches that need that, but I can tell you there's 25 churches that we've got lined up. And later on, if you feel led, you can make a difference. When we invest in something like that, it doesn't come back void. It comes back with lives being changed. You see, David had a heart to touch the future by what he did today. He had a heart of sacrifice. And the last thing is this. David had a heart of action. He didn't just talk about what he was going to do. He actually did it. And I've got to tell you that when he said, I'm going to gather everything up and give it to the temple, he went and got it. You read about it. He brought it. And when he did, all the leaders are standing around going, oh, whoa, look at that. Hey, let's go get it ourselves. And all the leaders went, and it said when that happened, the people that were watching, it says they were full of joy. They saw what would happen. And then you see it's built, and the glory of God fills the temple. And God says, David, I give you credit that it was within you. Folks, we live in a world where we talk about a lot of things. But God isn't into lip service. He's into action. He wants people not only to talk, but to walk the talk. And if we will be people, where we go to work, where we go to school, and we walk in and we see somebody with a strained look on their face, and it may be death, it may be sickness, it may be stuff they're going through, instead of walking past, but stopping and saying, I don't know what's on your mind, but I'm praying for you today. You've just been a person of action. You've just stood in the gap. Yes, the mission fields, Africa, Asia, and Europe, but can I remind you, when you walk out the doors, you're in the mission field. This is the mission field. I close with this. My wife and I have spent many years in ministry. I can tell you that I've been a diabetic for 50 years. I live off of an insulin pump, and without it I would die. And God has given me grace to travel this world. And there are times, I tell you on this last trip, I had what they call fasciitis or whatever it is, where a band in the bottom of your foot snaps. And the doctor there said, oh, put some lifts in your shoes. And I did, but didn't realize it pushed my numb toes. I haven't felt my toes for 20 years up against the front of the shoe. And the day before I flew back, I took my shoes off, and I don't want to describe, but when I got back, the doctor said, you need to put your feet up and not get off of them for about 3 weeks. And I said, thank you. And God has been touching me day by day. No infection. But there are times people say, why do you do what you do? Why do you do it? It's the fact that we can be comfortable in life, or we can realize that working for God sometimes can be painful. It can be sacrifice, but it's so rewarding. A few years ago, and I close with this, I went with Timberline Church to a pastoral staff retreat at the Sheraton up at Vail. As we got in there and sat around, and my wife was with me, a lady came out to just welcome us all at our table. And the minute she walked out, I saw her face. I saw some purposeful scars that were on her face. And I turned to my wife, I said, she's from Kenya. And when she began to speak her English, I knew she was from Kenya. So she walked over to the side, and my wife's the quiet type, and I said, I'm going to go talk to her. No, just stay here. But I had to, and I walked over with her back to me, and I said, Jambo. She turned around, and she said, oh, si Jambo. I said, habari yako, how are you? Mzuri, I'm fine. Now, Wewe, I'm fine too. I said, Jina lako ni nani, what is your name? She said, Mary. Jina lako ni, and I said, Jina langu ni Jay. She says, how do you know my language? I said, because I lived in Kenya. She said, yes, I'm from Kenya. I said, I know that. She said, what did you do in Kenya? And I told her when I lived there. And all I had to say, I said, she said, what did you do? I said, did you ever see the TV show Rainbow Surprise? And I didn't even get the word out when she went, you're Uncle Jay. You're Uncle Jay. I said, yes. I said, where did you watch me? She said, oh, I lived in the squatters' village across the street from the Bible college in Kisumu. She said, I was in my house, I was 6 years old, and all of a sudden I heard on a loudspeaker, Watoto, Watoto, Keribuni kwa kanisa. And I ran out, and she said, you were waving, but then I saw a yellow and purple gorilla. And she said, I was scared, but the gorilla waved to me and said, come. And she said, I followed the other many kids across the street, and when I got over there, you introduced me to Jesus. She said, I was so excited that I went home and I told my brothers and sisters and my parents what had happened. And she said, all my cousins and my family came the next day. And she said, when you left, I began to go to that children's church, and my parents came, and my parents got saved. And she said, my whole family got saved. And she said, can I tell you that today, my brother who got saved is now the children's pastor in the squatters' village, and he runs 1,000 kids, the most they can put into that building every single week. She said, you will never know what you did. And I thought, how close did we come on that day, because it had rained, of saying, we don't want to get muddy. We don't want to get dirty. Hogwash. Oh, that makes sense. I said, we're going to go. And can I remind you, I couldn't be a person of just words. I had to be a person of action. And if you will remember that if you will have a heart to touch the future by what you do today, if you will have a heart of sacrifice, if you will have a heart of action, you will change Delta. You will change Colorado. You can change this world if you're willing to make a difference. And the day we will stand together, God will say, you weren't there for the end result, but I give you credit for what you've done. Well done, thy good and faithful servant. Let's pray.